Continue our study of the book of 1 Kings. We're, of course, in the life of King Solomon. The chart that we constructed last week, I think, is extremely important, and I want to spend a little time talking about it today because here we are, and we plotted the course of much of what I call Israel's history. Of course, Israel himself doesn't come along until fairly late in the game. But what we plotted was the moral, if you will, or spiritual decline and ascent of the nation of Israel throughout the Old Testament. And one of the things that we discerned, which I believe is a rather profound point, and something that we need to spend some time thinking about, is the fact that Solomon's reign, during the time of Solomon's reign, I think we see represented what is probably the high point in the life of Israel, probably the highest point in the life of Israel between the time that Adam and Eve were in the garden and the return of Christ. I'll submit to you that you probably cannot find any higher point, any higher spiritual point in Israel's history than the reign of Solomon. But ironically, I think Solomon's reign not only represents a high point, but it also represents a low point in the life of Israel. You know, so I guess what I ought to do is redraw our chart to show that during Solomon's reign, the descent is actually probably more rapid than that. The descent during Solomon's reign probably goes almost like this, and then sideways. And we're going to talk today, I think, about what I believe to be the highest point in Solomon's reign. Now, we talked about it last time. I think last Sunday and the Sunday before, we talked about Solomon's building of the temple and Solomon's dedication to the temple, his beautiful dedicatory prayer, his benediction, and the fact that after the temple was built, which is really quite an awesome structure, that the presence of God fills the temple. And it's filled with smoke or a cloud or whatever, but God manifests himself there. And that was a pretty high point, but I'll submit to you that there's an even higher point in Israel's history that we're going to study today. And as we go through it, I want you to tell me what you think it might be. I might have a different idea than you do, but I think it's very interesting in what we're going to study. And I'll tell you frankly, what I thought about as I was preparing for this week's lesson, I'd never thought about before in terms of being a high point in Israel's history. So last time we left off in chapter 9, we read about God's warning to Solomon after the temple was dedicated, the beautiful building, and God's presence fills the temple. Remember that God warned Solomon. He said, God says, everything is good right now, buddy, because you're aligned with me. But he says, if you walk before me as your father David walked in integrity of heart, and if you keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom forever, just as I promised your father David. But, he says in verse 6, if your sons shall indeed turn away from following me and shall not keep my commandments and my statutes which I've set before you, and shall go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. So Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all the peoples. And he says, and this house, this beautiful temple that cost, in modern terms, billions and billions, if not $1 trillion to build, he said, I will turn this into, my translation says, a heap of ruins. Why? Because if you profane my name, if you don't keep following after me, this house that you built is worthless. It means nothing. He says, and I'll destroy it. And guess what happened? That's exactly what happened. In 586 BC, the Babylonians came in and literally burned and destroyed and turned that beautiful temple into exactly what God said, a heap of ruins. So that's the warning that God gave to Solomon. So it's not as if Solomon didn't have all the facts, all of the details. So all you got to do, Solomon, is continue to follow me and everything will be fine. But if you and your sons don't follow me, it's going to be bad. Okay, so we pick up in in chapter 9, verse 10. We're going to read through this chapter 9, verse 10. We're going to read through this rather quickly. Tommy, you want to read?
I'll pass.
You passed. Lonnie, you want to read for us? Chapter 9, verse 10.
At the end of 20 years, during which Solomon built these two buildings, the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, King Solomon gave 20 towns in Galilee to Hiram, king of Tyre, because Hiram had supplied him with all the silver and juniper and gold he wanted.
Pause right there just a second. So what we see here is that Solomon has given away 20 cities in the land of Galilee to this foreign king. What do you think God thought about that?
Not good.
Probably not too much, no. I mean, God gave this land to the nation of Israel, and here's old Solomon starting to give it away. So here again is another example of a decline. And it's interesting that these towns are later declared to be worthless. Read on.
But when Hiram went from Tyre to see the towns that Solomon had given him, he was not pleased with them. What kind of towns are these that you have given me, my brother? He asked. And he called them the land of Cabal, a name that they have to this day.
Pause right there. And Cabal means what? You've got a translation there that says means good for nothing. Yeah. And it's interesting that I think the towns are not named, but I'll submit to you that it's very likely that one of the towns that Solomon gave to Hiram was Nazareth. And why do I say that?
It was the lowest, considered the lowest.
Well, yeah, remember during the time of Jesus, of course we know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but he lived in Nazareth for most of his adult life. And when the people started to listen to him and learn that he was from Nazareth, what did they say?
What good?
That's right. Has anything good has ever come from Nazareth? I mean, it was viewed as a worthless territory. What's that?
Didn't even one of the apostles, when they said we found the Messiah, and he said, "Look, anyway."
Yeah. Could anything good come out of Nazareth? That's right. Was that Nathaniel?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Read on.
Now Hiram had sent to the king 120 talents of gold. Here's the account of the forced labor King Solomon constructed to build the Lord's temple in his own palace, the terraces, the walls of Jerusalem and Hazor, Megiddo and Gezer.
All right, pause right there just a sec. So in verse 15 we see that Solomon used forced labor to build certain things. One of the things that he built was a wall around Jerusalem. These days we learn that walls are immoral, according to some members of Congress. But nevertheless, Solomon built a wall around Jerusalem. He also reinforced several towns, including Hazor and Megiddo and Gezer. If you look in our chart up there of photos on the far left side at the very bottom left corner, you see a gate. That's a picture of a gate that I took that's in Megiddo, an ancient town, but supposedly that was one of the gates that was built by Solomon that's referred to right here. And so he built it up, and Megiddo, again, it's an ancient town. They've done some excavations there, and I think they said that they had found they did their excavations down, and they found like 26 layers of civilizations in Megiddo. So I mean, it's an ancient town. It's built up on a hill, and it overlooks the Jezreel Valley. I mean, just a commanding view. You get up there and you can look and you can see for it looks like hundreds of miles in either direction. And right there in that valley, right below Megiddo, is where the Battle of Armageddon is going to take place. All right, read on. 16.
Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had attacked and captured Gezer. He had set it on fire. He killed its Canaanite inhabitants and then gave it as a wedding gift to his daughter, Solomon's wife. And Solomon rebuilt Gezer. He built up Lower Beth Horon, Beth-del and Tamar in the deserts within his land, as well as all the storied cities and the towns for his chariots and for his horses. Whatever he desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and throughout all the territory, he ruled. There were still people left from the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. These people were not Israelites.
Pause right there. Verse 20, what that Lon just read is pretty significant too. Even at the time of Solomon, what do we have within the borders of Israel? We still have Amorites, and Hittites and Perizzites and Hivites and Jebusites. What's wrong with that picture?
They wasn't supposed to be there.
They weren't supposed to be there. When God, when God sent Joshua into the promised land, what did he say about those people?
Wipe them out.
Totally wipe them out, clean the land. Because for what reason did he say to do that? He said, wipe them out and do not intermingle with them under any circumstances. Why?
Because they would be
Intermarried.
intermarry and be worshiping their gods.
That's right. And they will turn your hearts towards the other gods. God warned them. He said, clear them out. But even in Solomon's time, they're there. And we see that they really formed the downfall. They become part of the basis for the downfall of Solomon. Hundreds and hundreds of years later. All right, read on.
Solomon constricted the descendants of all these people remaining in the land, whom the Israelites could not exterminate, to serve as slave labor, as it is to this day. But Solomon did not make slaves of any of the Israelites. They were his fighting men, his government officials, his officers, his captains, and the commanders of his chariots and charioteers. There were also the chief officials in charge of Solomon's projects, 550 officials supervising these who did the work. After Pharaoh's daughter had come up from the city of David to the place that Solomon had built for her, he constructed the terraces. 3 times a year, Solomon sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings on the altar he had built for the Lord, burning incense before the Lord along with them, and so fulfilled the temple obligations. King Solomon also built ships at Zezon, Geber, which is near Ephraim and Edom on the shores of the Red Sea. And Hiram sent his men, sailors who knew the sea, to serve in the fleet with Solomon's men. They sailed the Ophir and brought back 420 talents of gold, which they delivered to the king Solomon.
Okay, so a couple of things. Number one, we see in verse 26 that Solomon also built a fleet of ships. You don't think of Israel as being a seafaring nation, but at the time of Solomon, they were basically doing everything. And the other thing that Lon read in verse 24 says, as soon as Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house which Solomon had built for her, then he also built, your translation says the terraces.
Yeah.
Who's got a different translation in verse 24? Milo, yeah. We'll see that repeated, and don't know exactly what that is. Sometimes it's referred to as a terrace, but it's an area between David's house and the Temple Mount. A lot of times it's referred to as, it's called the Milo, but it's also referred to as like a citadel or a stronghold, or like a fortress, if you will. We don't know exactly what it is, but it's referred to frequently, and again, it's something that was built by Solomon. It probably was like a in medieval castles, they would have a keep, which is like the strongest point, the place that would be the last to fall in the event of a siege.
Well, mine says supporting terraces.
Yeah.
So I thought that meant like construction, making it strong constructionally, but that's not.
Well, we don't know, again, we don't know exactly what it is. It's referred to many different ways, and one of which is a stronghold.
Yeah.
So, it could have been all of those things. It could have been a place that was, structurally built up, but it's also a place that they could, a place of refuge that they could flee to that would provide them with some, some protection. All right. Now, chapter 10 is a very interesting chapter because it refers to this visit by this Queen of Sheba. Who was the Queen of Sheba? We don't know exactly. There are some suggestions in history that she was from either Ethiopia, which is directly south, or from Arabia, which would have been to the east. A lot of scholars say that she was from Arabia. I tend to believe that she was from Ethiopia. Why? Because, and the reason I say that is because Jesus, and we're going to talk about it later, refers to her as the Queen of the South. If she would have been from Arabia, Jesus probably would have called her the Queen of the East. But she was a historical figure. She figures into secular history as well. She was called Makeda, M-A-K-E-D-A, in secular history. But there's a very interesting thing about the Queen of Sheba, and I'll submit to you that this visit by by the Queen of Sheba, which is recorded not only in 1 Kings, it's also recorded in Chronicles, that this may actually represent the very highest point of Solomon's reign. And as we read it, I want you to tell me why that may or may not be true.
Well, seemed like recently, I can't remember where it was, that a child from them that I don't know if it was exactly hers, but it just was within the past 2 or 3 years was in the news about he just died and he was the last.
Yeah. Well, since you bring it up, that's right. A part of the tradition, part of the history, if you will, of Ethiopia, is that when the Queen of Sheba went to visit Solomon, the scripture records that Solomon gave her the desires of her heart. And according to Ethiopian tradition, one of the desires of her heart was that Solomon impregnate her. And according to Ethiopian tradition, she was impregnated. She comes back and she gives birth to a guy whose name was Menelik, M-E-N-E-L-I-K, Menelik I, who was regarded in Ethiopian history as the son of Solomon. And his line continued through, you all remember and I think the guy you're referring to is Haile Selassie. He was the emperor of Ethiopia until about the mid-70s, I think, and I think he was ultimately dethroned. But up until, and I think he just recently died, but up until that time, he was regarded as the direct descendant of King Solomon. And so they say that King Solomon's reign in Ethiopia lasted basically 3,000 years. So, quite an interesting tradition.
Well, that can't be a high point for Israel.
Well, no, that particular time wouldn't have been. But what was going on in Israel at the time is reflected by this. Again, this is a strange thing that this woman would come from, hundreds, if not, several hundred miles away. She comes because she has heard about not just King Solomon and all of his wealth and his glory, but it says in chapter, it says, and now when the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord. Read your first verse, Jackie. You read that to me this morning.
When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relation to the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions.
Yeah, see, that's very interesting. So the Queen of Sheba hears about King Solomon, his wealth, his power, but she also hears about his relationship to God. And so one of the things that she's doing, she doesn't know, I don't think she knows who Jehovah God is, but she hears about this king, this foreign king, who is wealthy and powerful and wise, but not only that, is he has a relationship with the God of the universe. And so she comes to inquire about that. And she comes, I believe, with quite a bit of skepticism in her heart. She comes believing that she can ask Solomon some questions that he can't answer. She believes that she can come and she can trip him up and she can prove him wrong. She can see that there's an error in the myths or the legend or about what has been conveyed to her about Solomon. She just believes that it can't all be true. So let's read this.
Wait, I have a question. So this function, this need to know, that has to be from God
I think so.
for her to.
So it's a way of discipleship, spreading the gospel? I'm wondering.
That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
Instead of 3 wise men, they sent 1 wise woman.
Well, that's exactly the thought that I had. This is not unlike the 3 wise men who were foreigners, who saw something, who heard something, who perceived something in nature that caused them, it inspired wonder in them and caused them to make a journey at a long distance just to go see, and to worship this king. So again, I think what Brother Kenny brought up, that the visit of the Magi to the stable in Bethlehem is the New Testament equivalent of what's going on with the Queen of Sheba. Here when she comes to see Solomon. All right, Troy, you want to read for us?
Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great
Retinue.
What'd you say? Retinue, with camels that bore spices, very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers, and his entryway by which she went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her.
Pause right there. There's an almost identical account, almost verbatim account of this. There are a few words that are different in Chronicles when you read about this. My translation says here, what Troy just read, my translation is saying, after she saw this, it says there was no more spirit in her. In Chronicles, it says she was breathless, or it took her breath away. In other words, she sees all this stuff, and she is absolutely astounded by it.
Overwhelmed.
Yeah, overwhelmed. That's it. She just overwhelmed to the point that you know, she came there kind of feisty, if you will, thinking, I'm going to show this guy up. I'm going to disprove him. And she just.
I think the reports were greater than what actually was.
That's right. That's right. But here's what I want us to think about. It says, when the queen of Sheba perceived all the wisdom of Solomon, then it says she perceived his wisdom, and then it names 7 things. It says, the house that he had built, and you can see that pretty fabulous house, but even to the food of his table, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his waiters and their attire. So the waiters and what the waiters are wearing impresses her, takes her breath away. His cupbearers. And my translation says his stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord. I think other translations say his altar of sacrifice.
Burned offerings.
Yeah. So the idea is that not so much the stairway itself, and maybe not even the altar of sacrifice, but just the fact that that he made these sacrifices, he went up to the temple with such reverence, okay, and with such purpose.
And humbling himself.
Yeah. But it says that after she saw these things, it took her breath away. She was overwhelmed. It took the spirit out of her. What was it about these things? Think about it. What was it about the food on his table? What was it about the seating of his servants, or what his servants were wearing? Why would that impress the Queen of Sheba so much, to the extent that it totally took her breath away? She just dropped all her defense, and she says, "You win, I lose." They were right. You know, everything is said about you, it was right, and so much more. What do you think?
Well, she had a lot going on where she came from, and thought she had it together, where she was.
Yeah.
So after hearing all this about Solomon, she had to go and prove it to herself with a lot of skepticism.
Yeah.
And when it was shown to her, she realized this is total organization.
Yeah.
And this is all because of the Lord.
Yep, that's it. Total organization, but I think what she saw when she looked at all of these things, she saw that Solomon's life was organized, if you will, or arranged. It was totally devoted to serving God. Everything that's listed here, I think the house that he built, the food on his table, pointed to God, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his waiters, everything she saw pointed to the fact that Solomon was doing everything he could to totally align himself with God's plan for his life. And think about that in terms of this man and what he does insofar as the life of the Queen of Sheba is concerned. The fact that this Queen of Sheba, this Gentile woman, this heathen woman probably, she comes after she's heard rumors, and she sees a man whose life is totally attuned and totally aligned to God. The profound impact that it has upon her, and really upon the life of her country, Ethiopia, for 3,000 years. For 3,000 years, they think about Solomon. They think about their ruler is a direct descendant of Solomon. Well,
She also sees a different God. She sees
Yes.
a God that she's
thinking maybe
all
he
the
does have
countries
the right
around don't have this God.
Yep, there you go.
It did, but what it seemed like to me that they worship God after that, when she went back.
Yes, yes. In fact, it is
That
said,
son?
according to the other traditions, besides that, it is said, according to some traditions, that's where the Ark of the, that Solomon actually sent the Ark of the Covenant, or at some later point in time, I don't know if it was Solomon, but later on, that the Ark of the Covenant was actually sent down to Ethiopia for safekeeping. And according to some traditions, there is a monastery in Ethiopia where the actual Ark of the Covenant still exists.
It seemed like they, come on now, did sacrifices to God.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, you know, in the last thing when that guy died or something, seemed like that's what they said, they were still sacrificing to God.
Well, if we think in the New Testament story about the Ethiopian and Philip, there must have been some movement in Ethiopia.
Right.
That he went to.
Yeah. The Ethiopian eunuch, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Could it be with these servants and all, that he treated his servants and whatever, all these people named, with respect?
I think that's right. Yeah.
The
Kathy said a
respect the
different-
whole nation had for him, you know?
Yeah. It says, like my translation says, the seating of his servants. Typically, you wouldn't think of servants as being seated, but that's probably an idea that they're shown respect because they got their seating too. And it says, and the attire of the servants, they were evidently dressed very well in a manner that showed respect to them and dignity to them as well. Okay, read on, Troy, verse 6.
Then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And indeed, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard. Happy are you, your men, and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you, sitting you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord has loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness."
Pause right there. I think that verse 9 that Troy just read is sort of the culmination of the Queen of Sheba losing her breath, right? She's totally overwhelmed. She loses her spirit, but when she perceives all this, what does she say? Blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel. In other words, she's acknowledging there is a God. This God that Solomon worships is the true God, and he is the one that made you what you are, which is, just beyond her comprehension. Now,
But it sounds like she believed in a God, but her God wasn't working as good.
yeah, that's probably right. That's
She
probably
wasn't as
right.
blessed, huh?
Yeah.
In Daniel, was he still alive in this time? Or he had finally died off
Daniel? No, he comes along later.
later?
Yeah, he
Yeah,
comes
that's
along during
right.
the time of Babylonian captivity.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I put a little star right there in verse 9. And I'll submit to you that represents the highest point in Israel's life of any Israelite, or the nation as a whole, between Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the return of Christ. Why is that? Am I right or wrong about that?
He must have been close to God because he was being blessed. And they were listening to God.
Yeah. Not only was he being blessed, and more important than Solomon's being blessed, what else?
Well, it's a witness to the world. It's
Exactly.
evangelism taking place.
Exactly. I'll submit to you that this is exactly what God intended for the nation of Israel from the very beginning, to do exactly what Solomon did right here, right? And which is what?
Be a witness to God.
That's right. To live your life and to order your life such that people around you, foreigners, heathens, when they see what you're doing, they will see that your life is totally aligned with your God, with the
And
God of the
different from
universe.
theirs.
That's right.
And different.
And it's different from theirs, and will in the words of Scripture, will overwhelm them, will take their breath away, will cause the Spirit to be taken from them, and cause them to say, "Blessed be the Lord your God." That is what Israel, I think that's what God intended for Israel to be. But guess what? That's what God intends for all of us to be, right? And how wonderful it would be if we could live our lives, if we could order our lives. Our homes, the food on our table, the seating of our servants, the attendant of our waiters, our cupbearers. Who's got a cupbearer here? The stairway, the means by which we go back and forth to church. What's that? It's a cupbearer.
Don't they all have cupbearers? Come on.
That's what I was gonna say, mine passed away.
But what is really important is that she recognized it was God. It was not Solomon. It was God.
Yeah.
And that's the witness right there.
Probably
When
by-
that person recognizes it's not you, it's God.
Yeah.
But by her talking to him and observing him, she realized that, the Holy Spirit or whatever
Yeah.
came up, but it was because of his closeness to God that she saw that.
Yeah, and it is because of that witness, not just what Solomon said, but what he did, that resulted in the Queen of Sheba's salvation. The Queen of Sheba was saved. You believe that? Let me tell you why I believe that to be so. This is in Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 38. Some of the scribes and Pharisees answered Jesus, saying, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." But Jesus answered and said to them, "An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it, but for the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a whale, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment, and shall condemn it, because they
Wait a
repent."
minute, Matthew 12:28?
Matthew 12, 38.
Oh, okay,
You with me?
yeah, I thought you said 28.
38.
Your cupbearer's law.
I know.
I'm lost.
Okay. Let me start over, just pick up.
Go ahead.
Verse 41, "The men of Nineveh shall stand up with this generation at the judgment, and shall condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah." And you remember the story of Jonah. Jonah was called to preach in Nineveh, and he showed up and he started preaching. He had like an 8-word sermon, and people repented, right? And so those people were saved because of Jonah's ministry. But here's the point, verse 42. "The queen of the south," which is the Queen of Sheba, "shall rise up with this generation at the judgment, and shall condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here right now." So the Queen of the South, Queen of Sheba, that's who Jesus is referring to. The Queen of Sheba, she came because she heard of all these wonderful things, and she was converted. And Jesus commends her right there and says that she'll rise up with this generation at the judgment time, and she'll be one of the saved, and she'll be one of the ones who condemns those who didn't believe. Because what Jesus is saying, everybody had the same opportunity as those men in Nineveh who heard Jonah's 8-word sermon and repented. Everybody else had the opportunity to see the splendor and the glory and the wisdom of King Solomon and recognize what it was, but they didn't. But the Queen of Sheba did, and therefore she will be saved, and she will rise up, and she will, at the end of time,
God
she will judge
was
them.
drawing her, and she made the right decision.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It was, as Kenny said, it was the Holy Spirit that was drawing her all along. She wasn't doing this of her own accord. She was being drawn, just as I believe the Holy Spirit calls everybody. Human beings are given free will, which we think is a blessing, but it's also a curse, because this thing we call free will allows us to do what? To reject the call of the Holy Spirit. And too often we do that. So again, I'll submit to you that this represents the high point in the life of Israel, the highest point between Eden and the coming of Christ, because what? It shows a man who is so dedicated to God. He had so ordered or arranged his life around God and God's plan and purpose that this person, this heathen, the Queen of Sheba, she saw him and she was just overwhelmed. She heard, she saw, she witnessed, she was overwhelmed, she believed, and she was converted. And I mean, to the point that Jesus himself refers to her and how she heard something that others didn't hear.
You know, when you look back in 4 and talk about the wisdom of Solomon and how he compared to other people, and then hear about it was spreading throughout the world, even Queen Sheba makes me, Jack, I really need to study Proverbs more, huh?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's got to be some great wisdom in there if he's that smart and the Lord's working with him.
Yeah. Read one proverb every day to correspond to the day
I
of the
mean, when
month.
you think about, God says this is how the wisdom he gave him. Then he wrote over, what, 3,000 or so parables? All right, Proverbs.
Yeah. Proverbs, they're important stuff. Yeah, in fact, you know, Proverbs 3 is probably one of my favorite chapters in all of Scripture, and it is a commendation of wisdom and the things that wisdom gives to us. Yes, sir.
Excuse me. Was Queen of Sheba the supreme ruler, or was there a king of Sheba?
Johnny, you ask such hard questions.
Okay.
I don't know. There's no reference to a king of Sheba, so she must have been the supreme ruler. I mean, she brings a lot of stuff with her. It doesn't say that her husband approved this. I think she came and she brought a bunch of gold and spices and all sorts of stuff. So I suspect that she was probably unmarried at the time. It would have been suspicious, I think, if she returns with a bun in her oven, you know, that what the king of Sheba might have done with her when she got back.
Funny thing happened to me on the way to work.
The crazy thing about this wisdom, you know, what it can do for you. I don't know.
Queen of Sheba, a black-headed person?
I would have thought that she was. You know, the Ethiopians. In fact, it was interesting. Jack and I used to go to a restaurant, Acme Seafood, and there's a girl waited on us. Her name was, we called her T. Tawabech was her name, and she was Ethiopian. She was as black as she could be. A very pretty girl, though. But she had her features, you know, were not like African blacks. And so I asked her one time. I said, if you don't mind my asking, what is your heritage? She said, I'm Ethiopian. And she said, and I said, well, what do you think about the tradition of that your leader was a descendant of Solomon? She said, oh yeah, that's exactly right. She said our leadership was a direct descendant through the Queen of Sheba. So that was a part of their culture. I think her parents had come over here from Ethiopia, and she lived in America, but she was very black, very, very pretty. You know, features more like Europeans than Africans. But yeah, it's interesting though, that if you pull up a picture of Haile Selassie, who was the last in the line of Solomon, he is very light-skinned. So, you know, a light-skinned guy among the very dark-skinned Ethiopians, I don't know, maybe that supports the theory.
In the history of Egypt, the pharaohs were all men, but there was one woman, one female in there that was,
Right.
and she would adorn and dress the attire of a pharaoh when she was out with going out to the people and everything.
Yeah. Don't make Cleopatra?
Yeah, it was Cleopatra.
Oh, another one? Oh, then you're right. You're exactly right. Yeah. I can't recall her name right now.
Well, Cleopatra traveled by herself. You know, she didn't have.
Yeah. Cleopatra was a Ptolemy. She had some Greek background.
When she went to visit the Romans.
Yeah. Okay, verse 10. Joanne, you want to pick up from there? Pass. Sarah?
Okay, and she gave the king 120 talents of gold, large quantities of spices, and precious stones. Never again were so many spices brought in as those the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon.
Pause right there. Gave her 120 talents of gold. Now, talent, we don't know exactly what it is, but it's probably about 100 pounds.
100 pounds?
Mine says a talent is around 75 pounds.
Yeah, so some say 75. A royal talent, I think, was 100 pounds. So somewhere between 75 pounds and 100 pounds of gold. So that would be about, one talent of gold in today's market would be about $2 million. So she gave him about $250 million in gold.
Mine says 4.5 tons of gold.
Mine too.
4.5 tons.
That's a lot of gold.
Seemed like that would sink her ship.
Yeah.
Yeah. And spices and precious stones. Hmm. And
Just throw it in the
where-
corner.
Where is it now?
Throw it in the corner.
Where is it now?
It's probably buried under Solomon's temple.
Probably so.
Oh, sure.
All right, keep reading, Sarah, verse 11.
Well, it looked like, besides her bringing him gold, she went over and asked him for some gold.
She had plenty.
I think that was the custom
She
to
must
pay
have had
respects
enough,
to each other.
Yeah.
If she could give that much away, I'd say she had plenty.
I would say so too.
Y'all were wondering where it was. It's on the top of that dome with a dot. See it right now.
But can you imagine traveling with that much stuff? Just think of us traveling.
Yeah.
We think 2 suitcases is a lot, and then kids a long way. And can you imagine, they're loading all this stuff, we're on camels, we're moving. How long did it take them to get there? Years?
Not to mention all the spices and.
But, you know, she's got a caravan, but at that time, she was probably going first class is what I'm saying. Things have
Nevertheless,
changed.
it's a long time ago.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm not a good traveler.
no doubt about that. You look in the service for World War II, it took them 30 days, I think, by ship to get over to
Yeah.
Germany and stuff like that. You know, now they would fly you over there in a few hours.
All right, read on verse
Had
11.
that flight from, was it from Singapore to something, is a direct flight?
19 hours.
19 hours?
Yeah, that's the one I put. I was 15, that's long enough for me.
Can't imagine.
But that's blind.
All right, read on, Sarah.
Why, I can't, no, thank you.
Verse 11.
Let's see, Hiram's ships brought gold from Ophir, and from there, they brought great cargoes of algam wood and precious stones. The king used the algam wood to make supports for the temple of the Lord and for the royal palace, and to make harps and lyres for the musicians. So much algam wood has never been imported or seen since that day. King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for, besides what he had given her out of his royal bounty. Then she left and returned with her return to her own country.
So a very interesting account of the Queen of Sheba, quite a noteworthy woman. Warren, you want to pick up verse 14? This sort of summarizes what I think is the high point of King Solomon's reign before things turned south for him.
The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents.
Falls right there. That's a lot of gold.
Where are they getting this gold? I mean, from mines, but is it in Israel? I mean, in the Holy Lands? Where are these mines at?
I don't know. They say there's a lot of gold in Ophir, but I don't think anybody knows where Ophir is. And, you know, there are legends about Solomon's silver mines, supposedly some of the richest mines that ever were.
And he had these ships, so who knows where he was going, huh?
Who knows? Only he knew. And I guess God told him exactly where to go and where to mine, you know, and
How to do it.
where God sent him, probably the gold and silver were just very plentiful. Didn't take a whole lot of effort to get it, so he had a bunch of it.
Why the 666?
Well, and that's a very interesting
Yeah, I
point
was
too.
wondering that too.
Well, this says something too, and I'm glad you noticed that. It says the weight of gold was 666 talents. What else do we know about 666?
Sign of the devil.
Yes, I know. And it also says in verse 19, there were 6 steps that led to the throne of Solomon. It is said by some that this number 6 represents what?
Mine says, symbolizes totality.
Man,
Represents man, yeah. 6 is the number of man. That was the man was created on the 6th day, and it represents man in the incomplete sense. All right, so that the number 6 represents man, but like 666 is like, it's sort of like man in the flesh rather than the spiritual man. And so I think what we're seeing here with these numbers, why 666? Why wasn't it 665, you know, or 667? Well, 666. Because I think this shows that at this point in time, Solomon has become more the fleshly. He's really more after the flesh than the spirit. And again, I think we see quite an amazing dividing point between the time that Solomon encounters the Queen of Sheba, and she basically confesses God as a result of what she's seen. Then over here, later in his life, that he has become more fleshly. And we're going to read that he was, chapter 11 demonstrates his turn to the flesh. And we're going to read, before we leave Solomon, we're going to read some from Proverbs, and we're also going to read from Ecclesiastes about just how depressed Solomon became at the end of his life and why that was, if he had everything.
But isn't this an easy way? I mean, I couldn't help but think as we read about Queen, she's recognizing material things. She's recognizing material things, and she's putting them up to him. Look at all these material things. Mm-hmm. And we as humans, when someone starts recognizing, oh, you're doing really well, you're doing really good, how easy it is to slip into, I'm doing and not God's doing.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I think the Queen of Sheba did see the material things, but I think she saw something.
Oh, I definitely agree with you there. But what she pointed out to him was his material things.
Yeah.
And she
so obvious,
right? And she made obvious. I mean, I think she was obvious saying they came. Your God is blessing you with this.
Right.
But I think we as a human here. Oh man, I do have a mansion. Oh, I do have the 59 cars, you know.
Right.
And it weighs on us to who's doing this.
So if he'd have been a good man but poor as Job's turkey, she might not have been impressed the same way. Right. I agree with that.
Gospel never got spread.
Well, she wouldn't have gone to see him.
Well, that's true.
That's probably right.
Although the wisdom, I think, grew her also.
Yeah. I think the gold and the grandeur, you know, is what brought her there, but it was the wisdom and what she observed about how he ordered his life.
I'm trying to think of who people say they go up to see. Some Indian.
Right.
You know, I mean, they go for wisdom.
Something Dalai Lama?
Something like that. Yeah. They go see that.
Okay, read on, Warren.
I left out 666 talents.
Yeah.
Not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and governors of the land. King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold, 600 bekas of gold went into each shield. He also made 300 small shields of hammered gold and 3 minas of gold in each shield. The king put them in the palace of the forest of Lebanon. Then the king made a great throne inlaid with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps, and its back had a rounded top. On both sides of the seat were armrests, with lions standing beside each other. 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, one at each end of the step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom.
Pause right there. What do you make of the fact that Solomon's throne consisted of, and surrounding his throne were 12 lions? What's the significance of the lions?
Tribes.
The 12 is a significant number, but just the fact that he would make a lion.
The power and authority.
That's part of it. I think it symbolized to some extent the Lion of Judah, right? But at the same time, the casting of an image. Did not God say, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image"? And here's Solomon making graven images.
Do you think God's happy with him with all this stuff he's doing for himself, these palaces? I mean, this isn't nothing for God. I don't see it glorifying God. The temple was for God.
Right.
Now it seems to be for Solomon.
Kathy, your taxes out there.
It is.
Uber's here.
Brother Jim.
Uber, Brother Jim. Okay, does he want me to come?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Jackie called time on us anyway, so we'll leave it off here. We're gonna finish this off, and next time we're gonna get through chapter 11. We're gonna kill off Solomon. But before we leave him, for his eulogy, we're going to refer to some Proverbs. And I'd like for y'all to review Proverbs and come prepared next time to recite your favorite proverb. And then we're also going to read from the first couple of chapters of Ecclesiastes. And we're gonna try to come to an understanding of why, with everything that Solomon had, was he so miserable at the end of his life, to the extent that he says, I hated my life.
Kathy, do you need some help?
No, I got it, thank you, God, I got it, I'm good.
I mean, I wouldn't want to help you.
No.
I'll get somebody here.
I just got to